All right, guys, and welcome back. We are getting ever closer to independence. Remember in our last lecture that we talked about the repeal of the Stamp Act, the tax on all paper products in the colonies that was for the first time directly an internal tax against the colonists, not a tax on traded goods as had always been the case, which was partly why the colonists had reacted so violently against it. Remember the starts of the violence, the tarring and the feathering, the burning of Andrew Oliver, one of the tax collectors there in Boston, his effigy from that Liberty Tree. And eventually the Stamp Act Congress is going to push for the colonies to begin this non-importation, which was basically a boycott of British goods. So instead of completing the triangular trade and buying those finished products from Britain, like guns and shovels and clothing and all those things that they make over there in England, the colonists would not buy that, and that really hurt those London merchants and, of course, these rich businessmen in London. They are going to put pressure on their friends in parliaments, in the House of Commons and the House of Lords, to get rid of this tax so they can start to sell their products to the colonists again. So the boycott worked. And remember, a repeal is when you get rid of something. So this was a big, big victory for the colonists. Their protests had worked. They had accomplished their goal. But remember, on the same day that Parliament repeals the Stamp Act, it is going to pass the Declaratory Act. You can see here. And here's the young King George III. Remember, he was just coronated when his grandfather died in 1760 during the French and Indian War. He's coronated when he was in his 20s. King George III is going to live and reign for almost, I think, 60 years as King of England into the 1800s. He's going to be the king during this whole revolutionary period. So here he is, the young king, and I'm kind of tongue-in-cheek. This is the Declaratory Act from him saying, "I say, I can pass any law you lot, and there's not a thing you can do about it. I say." That was terrible, but there you go. Basically that's what it did. It said that Parliament and the King have the authority to impose any law they wish on the colonists because the colonists are British citizens that are under them. Just saying, hey, you have to do what we say, even though we're getting rid of this thing because y'all didn't like it. We're in charge. And there is kind of this grappling for power going on between London and the colonies. So now that they've issued this Declaratory Act in 1766, Parliament really needs to back it up with some actions, because actions always speak louder than words, right? What you do is usually more important than what people remember rather than what you say. And so Parliament passes the Townshend Acts. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, that's kind of like the British position for the Treasury Secretary, like in charge of taxes and stuff. Chancellor of the Exchequer, that's very proper, was newly appointed, a man named Charles Townshend. So that's where this new taxes and laws are going to get their name from. And it was a series of several acts, actually. They had a variety of purposes, which we'll talk about in just a second. But I want to mention briefly what led up to this, besides just the Declaratory Act and Parliament wanting to assert its authority over the colonies. They knew they needed to assert their will. They needed to get money, because of the debt from the French and Indian War. They needed to make the colonists pay in some way, because the colonies exist for the benefit of the mother country. Where's that benefit, right? But obviously what they'd been doing with the Stamp Act was not working. So they actually hold a series of interviews that they conduct. And one of the most important people that members of parliament are going to question about, what did we do wrong? We don't understand. Now, how could we do this better? Actually inquiring and asking really good questions. They interview Benjamin Franklin, seen as the first American. He's constantly during this time in and out of Europe, usually in London. Remember the Hellfire Club, super mysterious man of mystery, man of the ladies, Mr. Benjamin Franklin. I bet none of you thought that, right? That Benjamin Franklin was a ladies' man. Oh, he sure was. And he spent some time in Paris, let me tell you. They actually have a statue to George Washington in Paris, and they have a statue to Benjamin Franklin in Paris. Paris. But yeah, he's in London and eventually becomes Postmaster General in the United States. But he is seen as a great American statesman, a great colonial representative. He's from Pennsylvania. We talked about him, negotiating for the peace and the lives of those praying Indians when the Paxton Boys were after them during Pontiac's Rebellion. So Benjamin Franklin goes before Parliament, and he's going to answer these questions about what was going on, what the colonists were thinking. And I'm not going to read the transcript of it, but it is pretty interesting. I mean, you get direct insight to what both Parliament and through Benjamin Franklin, what the colonies, perspectives were on this. And members of Parliament, they ask him, all right, why were the colonies so upset about the Stamp Act? And the main thing that Franklin says is that it was an internal tax, right? That was the difference. It wasn't part of the navigation acts that had always been the precedent. What we'd previously always had were these taxes on traded items. The Stamp Act represented something new because it was a tax on all paper products all across the colonies, an internal tax. And so the next logical question from Parliament was, okay, well, if you didn't like having this internal tax, what if we try to get money from y'all by doing it the old school way? Would y'all actually pay it then if we, seriously did some taxes on traded goods? And Benjamin Franklin's like, well, since that's the way it's always been, I mean, that should be the way that, we're used to. And so kind of inadvertently, Franklin gives tacit approval for Congress, or for, I almost said Congress, that'll be later based off of it, Constitution, for Parliament to enact these Townshend Acts, and that's what they do in 1767 in response to the interviews and stuff, and in response to wanting to get some money from the colonies. Okay, so that being said, the Townshend Acts, series of taxes, that's what a duty is in this sense, duties, that's taxes on imported products to the colonies, including glass, paint, silk, paper, tea, lead, china, porcelain. All these sorts of imports are going to have a premium on them, these tariffs. And another part of the Townshend Acts is that the money accrued from these duties, these tariffs on these enumerated items, these named items I just listed for you, that money would go towards paying for the colonial governors, as well as going towards paying for colonial judges from Britain that were over in the colonies. Now, the reason for this is it's called the power of the purse. We talked about this before a little bit, like actually with the Great Awakening. Remember that communities used to, like especially in Puritan Massachusetts and New England, the community would pay a tax for the church. And in doing so, they paid for the salary of the minister, whether they liked it or not. So in that sense, they felt ownership over the minister, what he was saying. If they didn't like it, they're like, what am I paying you money for? I have to pay you money. Might as well be good at it, right? Because that was their hard-earned money that was paying for their salary. Same thing here, the power of the purse. It was the colonial legislatures, the colonial assemblies, the governments of each of these 13 colonies that had been previously paying for the salary of the governor of that colony, even though the governor was royally appointed by Parliament and the king, his money came from the colony. Do you understand why that's important? Okay. Who do you actually listen to? The person who gives you your job or the person who pays for your job? Because why are you working? Okay. Maybe it's out of loyalty, and yeah, for some, sure it was, but I mean, most people, we work to make a living. Okay. This is our livelihood. That's why they call your salary your livelihood. I got to make that money. And so that gave the colonies a sense of ownership over these colonial governors and judges, like in trials. We talked about the importance of this. And so that's what Parliament and the king want to change. They want to get control back over the judges and the governors by using this money to pay for them through the crown. The other thing the Townshend Acts are going to do is also help set up and pay for officially those admiralty courts that we've previously talked about, like set up in Halifax, Nova Scotia, up in Canada. Nova Scotia. Scottish, New Scotland. But yeah, the Admiralty courts, remember, if you were caught smuggling, which will be the case for many during this time period as they start to crack down on smuggling and enforce the Navigation Acts and this other stuff, you previously would go before a colonial jury and they would acquit you because, you know, they're your friends and your peers, people who are like you. Now you go to an admiralty court way up in Canada, and it's by a judge who's being paid his salary now by the crown and parliament. You're going to be declared guilty. So that was a big deal as well, and oftentimes is very corrupt. You know, think of the writs of assistance as well. That are being doled out like candy at this time to British officials. They have this document that they wave in front of you as they're trying to board your ship, and you have to let them on, and you say, hey, why are you searching my ship? Or they come into your house, you know, with this writ of assistance, and you're like, hey, you know, what gave you the right to do this piece of paper? What are you looking for? I don't know yet, but I'll know it when I see it. Because remember, in a writ of assistance, it's not like our search warrants today that exist under the Fourth Amendment. That's why the Fourth Amendment was created, to prevent the unlawful types of searches that these writs of assistance allowed, where a government official was allowed to enter your private property and residence and ships and try to find whatever dirt they could on you. So all of this is happening under the Townshend Acts. And you will get some very important letters during this time in protest against the Townshend Acts. You're going to get letters from a Pennsylvania farmer written by a man who was not really a farmer, but a very rich businessman, plantation owner in Pennsylvania named John Dickinson, who will be a later patriot, member of the Continental Congress, founding father. John Dickinson's letters from a Pennsylvania farmer are going to circulate, along with the actual circular letter written by James Otis Jr. and Samuel Adams. Remember those guys? All of these letters, they're basically explaining why the Townshend Acts were corrupt, why they violated the colonists' natural rights as English citizens, that this was not a fair thing that the government of England was exerting against people who had agreed to it, but rather, you know, this was being foisted upon them without their representation, without their say. So that was the letters from Pennsylvania farmer, once again, and the circular letters in protest to these Townshend Acts. And how did the colonists respond? Well, you start to see a ratcheting up of even more of this violence and anger protest against British tax collectors and British officials and British soldiers. And it's during this time that the British authorities, including Lieutenant Governor, eventually Governor of Massachusetts, Thomas Hutchinson, is going to send in British troops to Boston, because Boston is one of the hotbeds for this fervor, this revolutionary spirit. Other places as well, you're going to see protests start to begin to erupt in places like South Carolina and New York. But yeah, in Boston is where kind of it's happening. And by 1770, you have over 2,000 British soldiers sent to the port city of Boston, Massachusetts, to kind of keep an eye on all of these growing protesters. And remember also, this is the birthplace of that mob rule, rebellious, rabble-rousing group known as the Sons of Liberty. Those people we've been talking about so far, I'm calling them patriots, I'm calling them rabble-rousers, Sons of Liberty. Keep in mind that it's still a minority of the population. The committees of correspondence that are starting to form in each of the colonies that are trying to kind of be the shadow, you know, patriot governments of these colonies at the time and disseminate or send out information from colony to colony and keep this revolutionary spirit alive, like what Samuel Adams is doing. They only make up maybe like 7,000 to 8,000 people in the colonies. These are the hardcore spirit of revolution. And then you have their readers and the people who they're trying to grab. But then there's another good half to perhaps even up to 2/3 of the colonial population that, are not really as gung-ho about separating from Britain. And in fact, nobody's really talking about separating from Britain yet. But people who are still very loyal to King George III, still very loyal to Parliament, still very loyal to Britain. That's still the majority of the colonists at this time. And remember also the context, like no taxation without representation is a valid argument using Enlightenment ideas about representation, about the natural rights of citizens, the consent of the governed and whatnot. But you also have the arguments from Parliament that was very real that colonists were not paying their fair share. British citizens back home in England, in British cities on the island of Britain, like Manchester and Birmingham and whatnot, they were paying far more than their colonial counterparts. They were paying like 26 shillings, more than a colonial British citizen. So a lot of people in Britain, a lot of members of Parliament, they're kind of rolling their eyes at the colonists, saying, "What are you complaining about?" But for many of the colonists, like John Adams and others, this starts to become more of an ideological struggle. That means this is a conflict over ideas, less so than maybe the reality. Okay, so those who are loyal still to Britain, they're called the Tories or the Loyalists. All right, and this brings us to Boston, bloody Boston, the Boston Massacre. It's going to actually begin in late February of 1770, and then the actual event takes place on the night of March 5th, 1770. And I remember that because March 5th is my anniversary. So if I ever forget that date, I know I'm in big trouble with my husband. So there we go. Always remember March 5th. But 2 weeks earlier, there had been a loyalist. Well, we just talked about those loyalist colonists. Ebenezer, what was his name? I love that name, Ebenezer, like Ebenezer Scrooge, but his last name wasn't Scrooge. But this loyalist Ebenezer, he had a friend who was one of the merchants in town that was not agreeing to the non-importation. So this friend of Ebenezer's was also a loyalist. They were still doing trade with Britain, and they were seen as traitors by the Sons of Liberty and these other patriots. And excuse me. Sons of Liberty and others, they began to attack Ebenezer's friend's business and basically throw rocks at his business windows and harass him. And so Ebenezer, that night, he was kind of tearing down some of the signs that they'd made and throwing them away and kind of cleaning up things for his friend. And some of the Sons of Liberty saw him interfering and doing this, and so they started to follow him back to his house, which is really creepy. That's scary. He started to get mob violence. So they follow Ebenezer back to his house where his wife and his children are, and a crowd starts to grow, and they surround his house. And so Ebenezer, he's terrified by this point. He's like trying to defend his family. He takes his old musket out, and he's kind of looking, like Malcolm X style, through the window shades, trying to see, where they are and what they're doing. And they start to, scream at him from outside the house and start to hurl rocks. And to kind of maybe scare the crowd away, at least this is what he says, Ebenezer shoots a shot out into the crowd. But apparently he was the worst shot in history because he ends up hitting somebody, not just anybody, a poor little boy, Christopher Schneider. Sometimes his name is different in varying accounts, but Christopher Schneider is kind of like the first casualty in the American Revolution. Although if you're ever asked this on a test, don't put that. This is too specific, I guess, for that. But Crispus Attucks. But Christopher Schneider, this little boy, he's like 11 or 12 years old. He's hit and he's going to die. And the next few days, they do the funeral procession, and they go through the city of Boston, holding up this martyred 11, 12-year-old boy who was hit by this loyalist, and saying, this is what the British have done, even though this was a colonial American that had killed the boy. And Ebenezer, they did not lynch him. He was taken into the authorities, and the trial he was given was one of those admiralty courts, and they kind of commute his sentence, and he's shipped back to England with his family. So he makes it out of there okay. I think he got off on charges of manslaughter and stuff, but the crowd is incensed, and purposely so, by Samuel Adams. He's making a martyr. That's when you die for a cause, out of this little boy. And he organizes through, his channels and the Sons of Liberty, a huge procession. Like, they have like over 2,000 members of the city of Boston, citizens, follow this procession, this funeral for this boy. Now, keep in mind, there are less than like 20,000 people living in Boston, Massachusetts here in 1770. Over 2,000 of them are attending this funeral. That's more people attending this funeral than like there are the number of British soldiers stationed around Boston. And so tensions are very, very, very high. And that had happened like 2 weeks before the night of the massacre. Also keep in mind this time, Boston is a city that's under martial law. You have these 2,000 British soldiers who are patrolling. These soldiers have to have somewhere to stay. And to that effect, Britain had passed what is probably familiar to many of you, the Early Quartering Act. There will also be another Quartering Act later, but basically the Quartering Act here, it says that colonists have to accommodate British soldiers. Now, what that usually meant, and this is often confused by students, is that they had to be able to pay for British soldiers to stay somewhere in an inn, which is like a hotel, or some other lodging, or maybe even a barn. They had to provide somewhere for those soldiers to stay, even if that meant kind of like paying a tax so that that money could go towards giving a soldier a bed. Sometimes, if they didn't want to do that, or whatever the circumstance could be, it could have also meant, maybe if it's a loyalist or somebody, that they would be happy to accommodate that soldier. And there were maybe some instances as well of soldiers not being as welcome, but being given shelter in colonist homes. Okay. Now, the common misconception of the Quartering Act, to quarter means to house someone, is that, of course, a British soldier comes and knocking and they say, I need a bed, and you have to give up your bed for that soldier. That's not exactly how it worked. But remember, there's always these misconceptions in history, right? That's why we need to look at what actually happened. But the point is that this Quartering Act, it had made a lot of colonists very uncomfortable. And also, there are these 2,000 soldiers living in the city of Boston. This is a peacetime army presence. They are going to need side jobs, and those jobs are going to compete with the local Boston residents in things like, catching fish and making rope. Rope making was a very common industry for a lot of the poor in Boston at this time. And now you have 2,000 extra, young men, or working age men looking for jobs, competing with those Bostonians. It's going to cause a lot of anger and resentment. And the last thing that was really fueling tension prior to this murder of this young boy was as well the fact that there were British patrols that went out at night around the city, its perimeter. Now, if you're a colonist, this is scary. It's like you can't even leave the city. You're under lock and key in prison, basically. Now, the actual point of these patrols was to apprehend any British soldiers themselves who were trying to flee, men who were trying to, like draft dodge. They were trying to run away and skirt their duties. So that's what those patrols were for, but it made the citizens very, very uneasy, uncomfortable. So that's all the background. Now we get to March the 5th, 1770. I just crashed this heavy chair on my toe. I'm going to try really hard not to scream. Oh, okay. Okay. So March 5th, 1770, it's a cold March night. This is Boston, Massachusetts. There's snow on the ground. It's very, very frigid. And at one of the customs houses on Main Street, King Street, you have a young British soldier, private named Hugh White, standing guard with his commanding officer, and they begin to be harassed by some young Bostonian boys, maybe teenagers. And this was very common at this time. There'd been lots of this going around. In fact, a few days earlier, there had been an event that almost started a big fight, but because they were going into the Sabbath, they kind of everybody just waited until the next week. So this is on a Monday, and this Monday night, the two men, they kind of puff up and get in each other's faces. And the young British soldier, Hugh White, he uses the butt end of his rifle and strikes the young colonist down. He doesn't kill him or anything, probably left him with a bruise. But the young man shouts for help, and a crowd starts to form. Hugh White and the officer who White had been verbally defending from this colonist who was calling him all sorts of insults and calling him a lobster back. That's a common slur for a British soldier because they wore those red coats and stuff. They are now being severely outnumbered, and nobody knows why exactly it happened. Maybe it was the Sons of Liberty or something, but the church bells also started ringing, which could also help to explain why the crowd grew so quickly on this cold, dark, frozen March night. So pretty soon, there's a British patrol that they meet up with just a block away, comes to join them quickly, and they attach their bayonets, which are those long little knives that go on the end. They're like a saber that goes on the end of a musket, and they load their rifles because they are staring down an angry mob of now several hundred Bostonians who have been alerted by the bells and these shouts. And there are very conflicting stories of what happens next, but that is the setting. There are 9 British soldiers surrounded by several hundred citizens of Boston. The citizens of Boston, many of whom are part of the Sons of Liberty, are shouting and hurling insults at these British soldiers. The captain of the soldiers, Preston, is kind of situated in front of his men, and he's talking to a colonial man who urges him. What's his name? Oh, he's Henry Knox. Henry Knox was his name. He's talking to Henry Knox, this colonial guy, kind of reassuring him, yeah, I don't have no intention on firing on these civilians. We're just trying to maintain the peace here. And I mean, the captain is standing in front of his men. If he told them to fire, that would be pretty bad because they would hit him, right? And of course, that's what happens. Shots do start to go off. Private Montgomery, it's believed, was hit by what the mob was throwing at the soldiers. They were being pelted by sticks, stones, oyster shells, snowballs, anything and everything have you that the colonists could get their hands on. They were throwing at these soldiers, and the soldiers were expected to take it. Just as we have today, Britain in the early 1700s had started their first riot laws. And a riot act, a riot law. This tells soldiers how they're supposed to comport themselves when they are met with an angry mob and mob violence, that they are not supposed to fire on civilians. Now they are, just a few men standing in front of several hundred angry people. They're meant to look menacing, and they should be able to defend themselves, but they can't be the aggressors there because they represent the government and the state. This is very relevant to the protests that we've had over this summer of 2020, when we've seen, and we are still seeing as I'm currently filming this, in August of 2020, violence against protesters. That is, regardless of what the protester does, that is seen as a horrendous thing, because violence by the state means violence by the government. That is an offensive form of violence. Versus violence by the protester, that's deemed more a defensive form of violence, right? Because they're protesting an injustice that was done to them by the government. And so regardless of the situation under these riot acts, there is a higher standard upon the soldiers. even though in the situation, you can imagine how frightened, how scared those 9 poor soldiers were, surrounded by this angry mob who's yelling all sorts of threats and violence upon them and throwing things at their faces. But regardless, Private Montgomery is struck in the face. He hits the ground, and then the first shot rings out. Maybe it was his gun falling and it went off. Maybe one of the other soldiers was trying to defend him, or his gun accidentally went off. Maybe they thought he fired. Maybe Montgomery fired because he was angry that he was going down or scared. Regardless, after Montgomery fell and the first shot fired, several other shots fired. And they were not like organized. It was one here, then another, then another. And then when the smoke clears, because these are old muskets, smoke's everywhere, it's dark, it's cold, there's steam, everything. When the smoke clears, there are several people in the crowd that have been hit. 3 are dead almost instantly, including Crispus Attucks, who will go down, usually seen as like the first official casualty of the American Revolution. Let me show you a quick portrait of Crispus Attucks. The thing to remember about him is that he was not white. There he goes. Crispus Attucks was of mixed race, considered at the time to be what we call like a mulatto. He had been a slave. His mother was probably a Native American woman from one of those Massachusetts praying towns. His father was African American slave. Crispus Attucks had become a slave who had run away and got his freedom. He lived under a fake name. And at this point in time, Crispus Attucks was a sailor and a part-time rope maker there in Boston. And probably, you know, the reason he was there on that cold night was because he was outraged and angered at the British soldiers taking away, you know, his job, you know, the competition for work as a rope maker there. I don't know if he had any feelings one way or the other, or understanding of the you know, the ideological struggles that were going on, but he was at the front of the crowd. He was among the first hit and first to die for this new cause that will be the United States. And so the first person to die for our country was a person of mixed race, an African American man. So that's Crispus Attucks. Now, 2 others will later die. So there were 5 total victims of this incident on the night of March 5th. This will be branded the Bloody Massacre or the Boston Massacre. And this is a really big deal, the propaganda that will take place after this incident. Their propaganda is something you see, something you read, whatever, that's meant to make you believe things a certain way. There's all sorts of instances of propaganda you can see alive and well today, especially in 2020 as we go into an election cycle. And one of the great examples of propaganda is the Boston Massacre, and this engraving that was taken by Paul Revere that will be distributed across the colonies, called the Bloody Massacre. And here is that engraving right here. And you can see, an engraving means like a picture that they would press out and then put in the newspapers. And Paul Revere, by the way, he's a noted member of the Sons of Liberty. Later on, during the events in 1775, during the shot heard round the world, the first battles of the American Revolution, Lexington and Concord, Paul Revere famously had that midnight ride, actually 2 other guys, where he's warning that not the British are coming. You thought I was going to say that, right? No, the soldiers, the regulars are coming. The British redcoats are coming. But yeah, that Paul Revere, he was a silversmith by trade. He's an artist. He was a dentist at one point, I guess, filling teeth of silver and other things. So yeah, that Paul Revere is famous for this engraving. I don't think he actually made it himself, but he used it, and it got distributed all across the colonies, so that everybody could see what these British soldiers had done. They just look at the painting there, the engraving. It looks like the British soldiers are in an organized line. It looks like their captain is standing behind them. He's got his saber drawn. It's like he's ordering them fire. And these guys, they're all firing it. Look, all the bullets are all going at the same time. There's all the smoke at the same time. And look at these colonists. They're just being slaughtered and mowed down. There's all that blood on the floor. This is a massacre, right? This is what you think of with a massacre. Now, is that same to the actual reality? Not so much. And that is why there is a very famous trial that will follow this. The trial of the Boston Massacre is going to be these 9 British soldiers put on trial for the murder of the 5 Bostonians that were killed. And kind of one really, really important thing to remember about this trial is that the lawyer that's going to defend the soldiers was none other than future second president of the United States, John Adams. They might be asking, why would John Adams, the cousin of the guy that, kind of pushed for this, who's been, causing and stirring up all sorts of trouble, whose own guys and the Sons of Liberty were the ones, hurling the insults and the oyster shells. Why would John Adams defend these British soldiers? Clearly John Adams, the founding father of America, is a patriot and a loyal American, right? Not a loyalist or Tory to the British Empire. And I think the reasoning is simple. John Adams was a righteous man, kind of disagreeably so to an extent. Like he was uppity and always felt like he was the smartest in the room. But he was a very righteous man who believed in doing what was right. He believed in doing the right thing. And in this case, he believed that these British soldiers were acting in self-defense and that they deserved, like every other person, to have a fair trial. And he was going to make sure that they got that here in the colonies. Now, in a more ideological sense, also by doing this, by ensuring that these British soldiers killing these colonists get a fair trial in the colonies, it affirms to the world, especially to those in Parliament back home in Britain and to King George III, that the colonies were able to administer their own justice that was fair. They were able to be reasonable citizens of Britain, not the rabid, soulless monsters that these sort of events would, paint them to be. So that's why he does it. And he does defend them very, very well. He goes through all the evidence, painstakingly so. And this is the first trial, in fact, where a lot of future trial precedents are set that will form the basis of America's legal proceedings. Like, for instance, it's the first time that you have like a jury kind of go out in their own session after they've heard all the evidence and kind of talk it out before rendering a verdict. John Adams also kind of creates the precedent of reasonable doubt. Was there reasonable doubt that the soldiers, acted in self-defense, that their captain did not order them to fire, that, they were doing this because they were under duress and fearful for their lives? And so, yeah, he wins this case. 6 of the soldiers are acquitted. That means they're seen as innocent. The captain, Prescott, he is also acquitted, innocent. And 2 of the soldiers that they definitely knew had fired into the crowd, but maybe because they were, defending themselves, like Private Montgomery, who was struck down, remember, they end up getting manslaughter and their sentences commuted to a few years, and they end up having to have their thumbs, I believe, branded with an M for manslaughter. But overall, yeah, I mean, this showed the world that the colonies were able to give a fair trial. I mean, you couldn't ask for a more fair trial than to look at the evidence. Like John Adams says, facts are stubborn things. I don't think he came up with that quote himself, but what an amazing quote for our day and age, right now, when facts are literally under assault, when we question what is literally evidence before us. Facts are stubborn things that cannot be ignored, John Adams says. We have to look at what happened. We have to see all the sides and then make our decision based on the evidence, based on the facts. And that's what the colonists did. And that was an amazing thing. However, it will not sway Britain as much as he had hoped. Britain's reaction to this will be, we'll see, kind of leading to the American Revolution, right? And the thing that's happening also is during this time, remember, news is very slow to travel. We had to form in the colonies, the Sons of Liberty, they had to form those committees of correspondence to make sure, you know, communication could travel between the colonies, because it's so hard. You have to, you know, send a ship to go over and send a message to England, and when it comes back, that's already over half a year. If you're fighting a war like the French and Indian War, you know, think of how slow it was for orders to go through. And so at the same time the Boston Massacre was happening, Parliament was already, because again, mostly the boycotts, that was the most punishing thing against England, that the colonists were doing, was these boycotts, the non-importation, not buying the British products. What Parliament was doing was that they were repealing most of the Townshend Acts even before the Boston Massacre had happened. They got rid of all of the duties, all of the taxes on everything except for, let's see, what could it be? What do they not, which tax do they not get rid of? Glass, silk, paper, lead, paint, porcelain. Oh, yeah. The only part of the Townshend Acts, those taxes that Britain will not get rid of, will not repeal, will be the tax on tea. So that is what's happening, and we'll set the stage for a little tea party in Boston Harbor in 1773. But before we get to that, last thing for this lecture here is a little incident in 1772, a whole year before the Boston Tea Party, called the Gaspee Affair. And the Gaspee was a ship, HMS Gaspee. HMS stood for His or Her Majesty's ship. So this is a British royal ship that was in charge of monitoring and catching any potential colonial smugglers. And the Gaspee was run by this kind of wicked captain, this British lieutenant that had it really out for the colonists. Like, he was known as just a bastard, excuse my language. They hated him there off the coast of Rhode Island. And so one night the Gaspee is chasing an American frigate, the Hannah, and the ship runs aground. You know, the bottom of the ship hits some shoals, some rocks, and gets stuck. Now the captain, this British guy nobody liked, and his crew, they're going to wait it out to the morning to when the tide turns, and they can hopefully get off the shoals and get free. But while the ship is just stuck there sitting, my leg's now gone to sleep. The hazards of filming these, the dangers. Okay. Oh, it was really asleep. Sorry. But while the ship was just sitting there like a sitting duck, maybe that's where that comes from. The Rhode Islanders, hearing that their prey was stuck, they go out on little rowboats, like you can see in the picture, and they are going to board the ship. The crew offers just a little bit of resistance. They shoot and incapacitate the wicked captain, and then they burn the ship down. They burn it down. And this was quite an incident, right? You have literally colonists attacking and burning down a royal ship that was there to patrol for smugglers. So that was the Gaspee affair. Also earlier in like 1768 or 1767, I think it was 68. You also had an important moment when John Hancock's ship, the Liberty, was boarded for smuggling, and his crew, John Hancock was a very rich, wealthy, handsome, young bachelor who, you know, did a lot of smuggling, especially for Dutch tea, from the Dutch East India Company, which he sold at much cheaper prices than like the British East India Company. He was a smuggler. The British tax collectors, they go after him to find his illegal smuggled Dutch tea, and his crew locks them up while they unload all the illegal items, and then they free the guy from the brig, and they say, "We don't know where the smuggled goods are. Sorry, you were locked up." And the tax collector's like, "Are you kidding me?" But this was an incident that caused a lot of friction there in Boston as well, prior to the massacre, because John Hancock was he was a notable citizen for his wealth and his popularity and his charisma, mostly for his wealth. He was also very handsome, ladies, although in his late 30s, I think he got gout. So watch out for that. But yeah, that was the ship, the Liberty, right? Very aptly named. John Hancock's ship, the Liberty, was boarded for smuggling. So there's these incidents that will lead up to our next discussion. And in our next lecture, we will talk about the Boston Tea Party, and we will get right up to the shot heard round the world. All right. Thank you guys. That's it. Bye.